Hello everyone, my name is Scalti, and welcome back to our Satisfactory Let's Play. Last we left off, we got about halfway through our aluminum facility build, and the kind of next major step is getting our train stations figured out, so that way we can then also build the other half of the factory. So we need to kind of figure out what's going on here in the middle. And between part 1 and part 2, I was kind of challenged with thinking I might have, kind of done the math wrong, and I did some more double checking, and I was like, oh, you know what? We technically, after kind of getting the math right, it was like, oh, we could do 5 trains or 5 cars on a train and then use the 2 outputs per freight car and just send a belt off to each spoke. So that's kind of what I was thinking about doing here, and ultimately didn't move forward with it. I didn't want to risk it, and then also it just didn't make sense. So opted to go for 6 train stations. We already have the load balancer figured out instead of this 2-to-2, and erring on the side of caution, wanted to make sure that we would in fact have enough throughput. The other kind of consideration with the material coming out of the station with Mark 6 belting is making sure that we could properly load balance it on the output, which I'm going to say that I'm 96.235% sure. So the major next kind of step here is, getting the stations placed, and this is that middle line, and it's technically affixed to the south and north end, which leaves that gap right there. And so I made a very difficult decision. I've opted to rebuild the factory. So it took a decent bit of time and effort, but I felt a little more safe and confident that this was the right decision. And so I stored a lot of, I stored everything. So I essentially used Skim to delete the entire factory and create what the website refers to as doggy bags, which are those little containers off on the side of everything that was used or everything that was deleted that was selected, which was everything. So to rebuild all this won't take too much time because I can just quickly go access the materials. I don't have to wait for anything to build up. But as part of all this too, I also want to revise the train network a little bit, kind of clean that up. I want to, kind of double check and see what we're doing underneath here. Make sure this is all good. The train's not going to go this way. I just have that there as a spacer to determine what the actual height will be. But what's different between all of this is how I created the outer ring. So initially we had this blueprint, and this blueprint essentially took a foundation at each step and rotated it 5 degrees, which is the vanilla rotation increment, pressing control while rotating a foundation. So we created the ring using this. So this results in a really nice clean outer radius because we are snapping the outer corners to make sure everything lines up and everything is flush. So essentially the outer ring is comprised of 8-meter long faces, and it's great, right? Because it's clean, it's proper. But if we go ahead and actually build foundations out from a center point, so this one is 12 from the mid, which means that we have a 23 diameter circle. You can see how closely it lines up, and this is essentially the other way of doing it, just with that minor little gap. But the benefit is that this, when this little gap adds up over time as you technically go around the radius of the circle, the circumference of the circle, you get call it a 0.5 meter gap. And this essentially allows us to not have that because the cardinal directions, north, east, south, and west, all have the same exact length. And so essentially everything will meet up cleanly based on that center, call it anchor point. With all that being said, let's take a look at our train route. So I've opted to not incorporate the 2 copper nodes over here on the west. Taking a look more centralized, we have 3 coal nodes that are pure And then right nearby, we have a pure copper node. So rather than having 3 stations, why not combine these nodes into 1 station? And so that way our loading depots, we only have 2 loading stations on our route. So those 3 coal we'll take and pipe into our train station, and then over to the east. Well, I guess actually first, we're essentially going to come down from the north, hit up that, and then kind of loop over, and we're going to tap the other 2 pure coal nodes that we have over toward the east. So essentially, we're going to come over to the east, cut down through the water, and potentially cut underneath the stone arches. I was kind of debating, like, do I really want to occupy this space and kind of be wasteful, because there could be a benefit to building a large factory in that location as well. We'll see. But we'll bring the rail down through the archways here, and we have some logistics to kind of navigate under for our versatile and automated wiring factory. We'll head over down toward the west, loop back around, have the station against that canyon wall here, where we'll load up and then proceed and keep going over to the east. And we'll head up this little ramp here, loop back down, and go down through this relatively narrow canyon. You know, I was kind of thinking at the time, you know, we could take the bi-directional rail instead of it being left and right. We could actually take it where the, you know, they essentially stack, and see how that goes. One of the additional factors with our train stations is figuring out, again, how to run the logistics from the stations to our spokes. So kind of looking at revising our water extractors here a little bit, just to make sure that we have essentially room for a sandwich layer. And so trying to kind of trimming the vertical fat with the excess vertical foundations here. The thought is, you know, kind of bring it down a little bit and then afford us the opportunity to kind of match the sandwich layers of each spoke. But obviously we still want to kind of fill this out just a little bit. So it's kind of, you know, going through the process of what looks good, what makes sense, and ultimately resolved with the 4-meter high foundations, but then also plugging the our ceiling light, our can light blueprint above them. In terms of the input and output of our stations, you know, like I said, I still want to have them loop around the base of the facility. So we have our bauxite that would be coming in from this direction into our station here in the center, and then drop off the payload and then head back out. And just making sure that I have the proper block signals placed, just so that way no trains crash, and we can kind of maintain the necessary interval. So we have our 6 stations, kind of working through here, making some good progress. So now that everything lines up, I feel a little bit more free to kind of experiment and not be worried about, oh, did I snap the foundations to the right orientation? It's all going to work no matter what. So we have an elevator here in the central-ish structure, and kind of debating, you know, do I want the elevator to be accessed from this side? Do I want to be accessed from the other side? But taking it for a little spin here, I obviously want to be able to kind of feature the spokes, and I really want to kind of communicate the mega size of this factory. So being able to look out towards the spokes, yes, definitely going to happen. You know, as a matter like, what's the way that we want to get to the spokes? You know, initially I'm thinking, all right, we'll be able to see out toward the spokes. But then when we get off the elevator, we actually head to the inside, and then we go out to the edges, and then we can go up around the spokes. That's terrible user experience. So we're going to make some gangways that connect them. But overall, kind of looking at how to recess the elevator, you know, in a similar sense to what we did in the supercomputer factory, I felt like this type of you know, vertical navigation experience was ideal. So kind of messing with the gangways here and doing a little bit of offset on the glass walls, more windows, I suppose. Kind of figuring out, you know, how do I want to get this to work, and and whatnot. And then I kind of quickly realized, like, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. We still don't even know if the factory is going to work once we have Mark 6 belts. So I, did a little bit of kind of just conceptualization, trying to understand, all right, what's going on? Is this in fact going to work, etc. And opted to, before we put any type of formal polish on this, we're definitely going to wait. We're definitely going to make sure that the factory works before we go putting forth too much manual effort. Replacing the spokes via the blueprints, easy peasy, not a problem. But doing all this handcrafted detailing, definitely don't want to unnecessarily waste time. With having our first station built, we get a little interesting. So adjusting the time to try and help see this a little bit better. And I tried to explain this. I feel like I did a good job explaining it live. I'm going to try and do it in post. But essentially we have a 3 to 5 load balancer here, because we have the 3 pure coal nodes and we need to split it evenly across 5 stations. We can't just do a 1 to 5 split each time, because 1200 on a Mark 6 belt cannot be split 5 ways with proper throughput, because you technically need to make a 6th belt, which I'm going to demonstrate here. That needs to loop back in on itself. So when you split 1200 6 ways, you get 6 lines of 200, and you're trying to take a line of 200, that 6th line, and bring it back into the input line of 1200. So essentially there's going to be a segment of logistics that's trying to carry 1400 items per minute, and you can't do that with Mark 6 belts, or just any belt that is full, where the recycled belt exceeds, or like the throughput of the recycled belt exceeds the input belt. So anytime you try and do, I normally say a prime split, but it's not always a prime split. But when you're working in terms of like base 5 and 7, those values are challenging to, I guess even technically 11. Those belts, or balancing, 1 to, those ratios, always need to start with a merger, because you need to take the odd belt out when you're trying to make even and loop it back in on itself to be distributed across the odd belts. So what we're doing here is I'm just trying to briefly demonstrate a 1 to 5 load balancer. So we started off with our input belt, and that immediately goes into a merger. And so because we're trying to do a 1 to 5 split here, what we need to do is try and make 6 lines. So we got our 5th line here, and now we need to take our 6th belt and loop that back in on the initial merger, and then those items will then get distributed properly across the remaining 5 belts. Now when it comes to the 3 to 5 load balancer, the reason why I kind of wanted to demonstrate this 1 to 5 here is just because visually it's a lot simpler to kind of understand, that odd belt out, that 6th line, and how that needs to come back in on the merger. So if we're trying to make 5 belts here, we need to take a 6th belt and loop it back into the merger, but we're starting with 3 separate belts. So what I'm doing here is I'm looking to do a 1 to 7 load balance. So we got our 6 lines, and now we need to try and make 9, because we're going to have our 7 belts as an output. But because the left and right splitters are splitting 3 times, we also need this split here to also split 3 times. So we take the extra 2 outputs from our splitter, and we can essentially loop those back in on the merger, and then everything's right as rain, everything will get balanced out. So taking all of that into account, I'm going to try and explain this as best I can. So we have our 3 belts. I tried to color coordinate them to make this explanation easier. So we have essentially a red line, a blue line, and a green line. I found the schematic on the Satisfactory calculator website, and the way it was displayed, I couldn't really wrap my head around it, so I ended up kind of redrawing it in a more symmetrical sense. Now this design is definitely not symmetrical, but in terms of just going through the paces of writing out the schematic, it really helped. So the way this kind of works is we have a red line that needs to split 3 times, and that's going to go into 3 mergers. 2 of the mergers on the left and the right get split into their own respective industrial storage containers, and then the one in the middle is just a single storage container. So our red line is a simple 1 to 3 split, as well as our blue line. So I'm kind of showing, you know, where the belts are traveling. So, you know, the 3 belts go over. Now we have our blue line. So this gets split over into a merger. This gets split underneath into the middle merger right here. And then the 3rd line, this one goes up and over and into the merger on the left. So now here's where things get tricky, is the green line. So the green line is the odd man out. This is the one that we need to kind of split and loop back in on itself. So we have the green line coming in, and this splits here in the middle, and then it kicks into a merger, which then feeds the middle merger that goes into our middle storage container. So the storage container in the center, its final step is to hit a splitter. So just, I guess, take a pause. So this is one line for the green, and then we have the split here that's kicking it out to the left onto these lines, or this line, and then to the right on that line. And that goes into their own respective mergers, which then go into the other mergers that the red and blue join. So essentially the target goal is the final mergers in the process all need to have a red, green, and blue input. So just highlighting the greens here just to make it a little bit more clear and how this all kind of works out. So this green merger that I'm highlighting here kicks into a white one for the center, but then we take our 6th line, which is this right here, and we essentially have to then take that 6th line and divide it evenly across all of our, we'll call them prefix mergers. So this splits once up and above, twice out the middle, and then 3 times over to the side. I get a little caught off guard here, thinking that that's part of the blue line, just because I'm a goofball, but that is in fact part of the green line. So just double checking and making sure that I'm clear about it. So highlighting the 3 lines that are being split, and this is the 6th line being split 3 times. So this goes into a merger here, which then kicks over to our left merger to feed those 2. We do the exact same thing over here. So one of the additional lines kicks over, that takes care of the left and the right, and then this middle belt heads out and down and back in on its own merger, which then feeds into here, which then also gets redistributed because it's going to hit the splitter once more, and then everything's right as rain. And so just to confirm, I went ahead and dropped 1500 concrete into a storage container and then had that balance everything out, and just doing it again for my own peace of mind. So typically whenever you do some type of 1500 or any type of split like this, it's not uncommon that one storage unit or one output will have one more than another, and then one other input would have one less. So just kind of going through the bases here just to double confirm, larger sample size to verify accuracy is always a good thing. So our second station here was a little fun to try and figure out, and I'm just kind of jumping to the resolution here and confirming my testing with what we've got going on. But this one's a little different. It's a little simpler in its own regard. So we have 2 pure lines coming in, but again, as I mentioned from the previous station, we can't just do a simple 1 to 5 split because we're trying to loop more back onto the input belt than what we can handle. So as a solution to all of that, I first needed to essentially split each line onto its own and then do a 1 to 5 split. So instead of doing a 1 to 5 and then dividing those 5 lines twice, I'm dividing the line up front and then creating 5 lines from the split. So we're trying to essentially load balance 600 items in a 1 to 5 split rather than 1200 into a 1 to 5. This was a really fun opportunity though to kind of create some visually pleasing logistics. So the input that we have here goes up and then it splits, and then each side goes into its own 1 to 5 split. So running through that, we have our input, and this goes into our splitter. So we're essentially going into 2 lines of 600, and then we go into our mergers. So again, we always have to start a 1 to 5 split like shown here with a merger. So we're going 600 into a merge, and then that merge goes into a splitter, which then splits twice. And yeah, I was like, oh, let me just show the top side. It makes more sense. So we have our splitters, and that splits out. But based on how this is all kind of sorted, the kind of fun part about this was creating all the squiggle lines and load balancing everything out. So just kind of reiterating, you know, can't just do the 1 to 5 split because it's looping back in on itself. So we have essentially our line coming through, and then our splits into their individual lines. And the kind of rule of thumb here is we need to make sure that every input into the industrial storage container has a merger, and each merger has 2 belts going into it. So the right side has 2 belts going into one, and then that feeds into the second, to the inside, if you will, so on and so forth. You can kind of see the pattern here, but I thought it came out in a really visually pleasing way. It's nice and simple, but one of the things that I'm going to change up, or that I did change up, is having the inputs to the splitters be positioned on the interior instead of the exterior, so that way we can just kind of trim the overall width of this station just a little bit. So flipping the splitters around, and then getting the belt work piped over, so that way we can get the station up and running. And a decent bit of a jump here, but took the time to have a little stream and get the factory, you know, we'll call it the alpha test, up and running, which is really exciting. So we got all of our trains placed, got all of our water extractors set up. Interestingly enough, I needed to put a pump on each one, even though technically a water tower solution here would work, where we just need 1 pump for each half of the factory, or each pipe network. So we have essentially 2 separate pipe networks feeding the north and south side of the factory. And then getting all the trains set up was pretty simple, just using block signals to, you know, set proper pacing, getting all the outputs from everything sorted out. So we used, you know, the original splitter system for the bauxite, and then the coal was really simple and straightforward. You know, it's because we had 5 stations, so that's 10 belts. So we did a 2-to-2 load balancer, as you can see here. And then the copper coming in, did a 2-to-2 load balance, and then split it. Or actually, we didn't need to do a 2-to-2. We just have an output from each one, splitting 5 ways, and try to make it a little condensed, and just having all of that being fed up into, you know, the kind of sandwich layer above everything here, and kind of figuring out, you know, I had to go through the paces a little bit and kind of understand, all right, if the copper's coming up here, coal's coming up here, and the bauxite's coming up here, how do we arrange everything going around the spokes? Which we'll get into here in a moment. But overall, it came out pretty clean. I think there's a decent bit of walking room overall. But have our coal coming up and over, and this is feeding the south side of the factory. And we have our bauxite. And like I said, just have the kind of blueprinted load balancers that we went through in part 1. But all that's being brought over, and I positioned the belting in such a way where we can essentially have this continuous movement, and we have a little bit of a staggered segmentation, so that way the bauxite and the coal coming up just directly is in line with their overall throughput going into each spoke. And then our copper here, we have that being, you know, fed up on our Mark II lift just to kind of set the pacing, and then we have our output belt coming back in. And kind of figuring out the order of all this was pretty fun and challenging. But we figured it out. You know, some of the belt, you know, pathing looks a little funky. I was trying to get, you know, things to be as parallel and clean as possible, but here we can see our kind of average throughput, so just under 400 items per minute coming out of each spoke, which is pretty nutty. You know, overall, I believe the formal output of everything is supposed to be 720, because we're producing 3,600 casing and 3,600 sheets, so it's 7,200 items total. Divide that by 10, so we're operating pretty decently here, despite the fact that we are hamstrung by our Mark V belts. I went ahead and kind of assumed I knew how to do the math of how we needed to underclock the water extractor output. So if we need 2,000 total, divided by 7 means that we need 285 water in total from each water extractor. But because we're taking only 780 items per minute, what is 65% of that 280, and then setting our water extractors to accommodate that. So everything is running typically somewhere between 65 and 70%. Our trains are bringing in more than the factory throughput can handle at this time. But either way, if we're running at 60-something% efficiency, we're getting 1,800 casing and 1,800 sheets per minute, which is a lot, even at this operation rate. So everything, I would say, for the most part, is running as expected or intended. And like I mentioned earlier, we're not really going to be able to fully understand if my math of how all of this works out does work until we can get the Mark 6 belts unlocked. But at the very least, at this operational amount, we're going to have more supply than we actually really need for anything until we complete the game. So at this point, I'm calling it good. We will revisit this factory at some point in the future as a part 3, where I will get all of the Mark 6 belts placed, fine-tune things, tweak things, make sure everything is working properly, and then ultimately, once that's complete, we'll put the final polish on the build. So for the moment, though, I'm really pleased with this. It was definitely a struggle bus at times, especially when it came to understanding trains. But we got there. I'm really happy about it. And I'm looking forward to wrapping this up once we get into the next phase and start unlocking Tier 9 technology. Really excited. Before we formally wrap up this episode, kind of thoughts, next steps, and vision is right now everything is kind of going into, well, not everything's kind of, it is going into an awesome sync. The intent is to kind of pivot on our drone distribution system. So we have our factory here that has our drone ports with the 120 batteries per minute, but turbo fuel and also rocket fuel is a more efficient fuel source for drones. So based on the fact that we recently-ish upgraded our power facility, where we can essentially double our power production if we really wanted to, given the fact that we have 2 coal and 2 sulfur nodes tapped. The kind of thought here is figuring out how do we create a distribution system for this facility. And so kind of soonish next step will be to get some drone ports placed on this factory, probably somewhere in the center. They will be temporary, like I mentioned. Don't want to do any overall final touches on anything. But where we have the awesome sinks here in the middle, the intent is to build some drone ports so that way we can distribute the output of this factory as needed. So that's going to probably involve modifying our power facility to provide packaged rocket fuel to be used as needed. With all of that said and done, we'll wrap it up here. I appreciate y'all. I hope you guys found this episode enjoyable, even though we're not quite finishing the build just yet. But if you did, feel free to leave a like. It does help out the channel. If you want to see more content, be sure to subscribe if you are not already. And if you have any questions about this build, any build, what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, leave a comment below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. It almost sounds like a voicemail, doesn't it?